the left is our 1803 map of Edo, zoomed into the Sumida River and rotated to have north at the top. To the right is a Google Earth image of the same area. The first difference between the two maps that we noticed, and one that we did not see in the Moscovian maps, is a pretty distinct alteration in the actual structure and course of the river. Much of this, as before, can be blamed on a lack of cartographic precision back in 1803, but we cannot ignore the difference of the layout of the city towards the south at Edo Bay. The modern image on the right shows that the confluence of the river and the bay resembles a delta, but rather than sandbars, there are pockets of urban development in this delta. While we certainly did see settlements around the Moscow River, those estates and industrial buildings were situated in accordance with the natural layout of the river. In contrast, in this Tokyo picture, the opposite seems to be the case. That is, the Sumida River near the bay is modeled around the buildings and houses themselves. One other thing to note is the considerable number of bridges in the Tokyo map as compared to the one of Edo. In 1803, there were no more than 3 or 4 main bridges crossing the Sumida, but we can see that today there are dozens. This is in stark contrast to, as you recall, the Moscow rivers, which have been all but preserved with as few bridges as possible. This is most likely not a conscious decision by Tokyo City planning authorities, but rather a natural side effect of the vastness of the population in Edo, Tokyo, as compared to its Russian counterpart. So this has been a slight deviation from a discussion of the physical layout comparisons of the two cities, but an insightful one nonetheless. Now, without further ado, let us return to more physical layouts and comparisons between Moscow and Edo. So I have already spoken about how fire and water affected the physical layout of the city in Edo and Moscow. Another key player, and perhaps the most influential, was the deliberate and conscious citywide planning that dates back to the 15th century. The fire of 1493 sparked chaos into the streets of Moscow, and warned its administrators that some semblance of a systematic layout was necessary to maintain order in a growing town. The city could not come to any meaningful consensus about how to approach architecture and layout until 1763, when the first rounds of graduates from the new Academy of Fine Arts and other higher arts institutions established a commission with the sole intent of restructuring the city. Their aspirations were high, and they were heavily influenced in style and in structure by their teachers, many of whom were European and stressed Western aesthetic values. However, this movement was heavily elite-driven, as the graduates themselves, when you think about it, could only afford to go to these schools because they belonged to noble families. Since at this time, nobles were still responsible for local administrative duties, what was supposed to be a citywide, modernizing and westernizing architectural revolution suddenly became more of a shallow restoration of buildings and main roads. Specifically, the only buildings which reflected any Western influence in their restructuring were noble estates, the Kremlin itself, and of course administrative offices in and around downtown Moscow. Road renovations heavily emphasized the highways leading to the center of the city, meaning that very little change permeated beyond the innermost walls of Moscow, perpetuating class divisions between the serf peasantry and the nobles, which is something I'll discuss later. This is indeed reflected in the map we see here. As we distance ourselves from the Kremlin, plots of land become larger and less developed, roads become less organized, and any indication of meaningful city construction and planning is absent beyond the outermost wall. In fact, up until the mid-1800s, much of Moscovian peasantry living outside of these walls lived in dilapidated wooden cottages, no stone yet, with no ornamentation or conscious design whatsoever, and very little access to roads and water. Regarding the actual layout of the two cities as a comparison, let us examine a side-by-side view of the two. On the left is a close-up from our 1803 Edo map, oriented with north at the top, showing Edo Castle on the left. To the right is a road map of Moscow, circa 1800. Notice that main roads in the Japanese map seem relatively organized, running straight or diagonally with a definite destination. On the right, however, the only discernible pattern is something of an all roads lead to Rome approach, with all the streets leading into the Kremlin. I believe there is more to this difference than just the result of random city planning. In my opinion, the very nature of Moscow and its Kremlin is in stark contrast with that of Edo and its castle. Edo's center, the place around which the entire city is constructed, was in effect closed off to the public. It was surrounded by water and brick obstacles and was intended to be left alone as a sacred place. In contrast, the very center or essence of Moscow is the Kremlin, and while some administrative buildings were indeed restricted from the public, At the very core of the Kremlin lay perhaps one of the most famous public spaces in the world, Red Square, which we will discuss further momentarily. For now, though, I argue that the road layout in Moscow is so centrally configured because the center of the city is where the cultural, economic, and social lifeblood of Moscow resides. In contrast, Edo's cultural center existed outside of the castle walls, in Nihonbashi, in Sakariba, and in the Cho. This could explain why, in Edo, there's something of a grid of streets and roads, while in Moscow, the only discernible pattern of roads is one in which they all point radially inwards, towards the center of the city. I'd now like to talk about the cultural and social aspects of Moscow, and how they compare and contrast with Edo's. Obviously, books upon books could be written about a comparison like this, but I'll try to touch on just a few interesting facets of Moscow's social culture, giving care to maintain a comparative approach between it and Edo. Recall that I mentioned a Western European influence in the architecture of Moscow. This, I think, is something worth examining further, especially when taken in comparison with Edo's development. This notion of westernization in Moscow was part of a much larger westernization movement taking place in all of Russia, and was at its strongest point right about when our 1808 map was made. It is interesting then to note that there was a clear external influence in Moscow's development, both as a city of buildings and as a city of individuals. In many ways, much of the architecture was meant and built and planned emulating Western and external influences. Meanwhile, all of Japan remained isolated from the rest of the world, so Edo's development and design is, through and through, inherently Japanese. In addition to drawing from European architectural principles, the people themselves in Moscow were a diverse collection of Western countries. William Libby notes that Moscow is believed to be the only place in the world where the representatives from so many nations can be found. Frenchmen, Turks, Greeks, Britishers, Germans crowded the streets of Moscow, giving it an element of diversity and external influence that was absent in Edo. This distinction is noteworthy because it suggests that, while one city can grow and establish itself entirely out of its own culture and principles, as what happened in Edo, it is equally possible, as Moscow demonstrates, to construct and survive in a city based off of foreign design and device. Also, it is interesting and a little bit ironic that Moscow, a city that was originally of many foreign cultures, is now considered a very traditional Russian city, while Tokyo today, formerly a city solely of Japanese construct, has now grown into a multinational conglomeration of technology, people, and consequently, cultures. As mentioned during the discussion of the road layout of Moscow, Red Square is the cultural and social climax of the entire city, the Sakariba or Nihonbashi of Russia. As seen in this picture of an entrance into Red Square via a bridge over the Moskva River, hundreds of people gathered here daily to undergo many of the same tasks as did those who gathered in Edo. Hawkers, traders, musicians, artisans, and peasants all practiced their trade here. However, unlike in Edo, this central place was the result of a conscious city establishment. Red Square was built to be a commercial plaza, and a commercial plaza it soon became. In fact, in 1786, the city installed commercial rows on the east and west sides, where traders and artisans could show their crafts in an organized manner. In contrast, bridges and fire breaks of Edo were not meant to be the social gathering places or commercial centers. The city administration built no commercial stands. Rather, they were created as such by the common citizens themselves. Interestingly, however, as we now know, Moscow's cultural center still remains and is perhaps even more revered now than it was then. On the other hand, the wide open fire breaks and social gathering places of Edo have since succumbed to modern development and have been relocated to predetermined areas. Now, countless slides could easily have been shown about Red Square and its cultural implications, but having laid down a rough comparison between it and its Edo counterpart, I would like to finish this presentation with a comparison of the social structures of Edo and Moscow.